We're now ready to work on the lighting in our scene. So I'm just going to hit the N key to hide that panel at the side and select the light object here in the outliner. Now in the properties panel, you can see down at the bottom we've got this little light bulb icon. If I click on that, that will show the properties for our currently selected light. In Blender we have a number of different light types that we can switch between. By default we have what is called a point light, and that will radiate light out in all directions. By selecting one of these options we can switch the type of the light. So if I switch from the point light to a spotlight, for example, and by clicking on this little arrow I can adjust the angle of the spotlight, you can see we create this focused light effect. I can also change to an area light, and what that does is it gives us a shapes light that will actually cast nice soft shadows on the scene, and we can adjust the shape to affect the look of the light. Now finally we have one more light type, which is the sun. But you'll see if I click on that, it's not really giving us the effect that we expect. The reason for that is that the sunlight casts from an infinite point in the distance rather than from this point in space here. So what that means is because we created our environment as a cube, the light is shining onto the outside of the cube and is not properly illuminating the scene. You can see that if we go into the outliner and just turn off our environment, now we can see the effect of the sunlight on the rest of our scene. The effect of the light is quite strong at the moment. If I just go in here and adjust that down to say 10, you can see we can actually see the color of the scene again now. But how do we get an environment in here? What we need to do is switch back on our cube, and we're going to need to take the top and side out of this cube. To do that, I'm actually just going to switch this viewport back to our solid shaded view so we can see things a bit more easily. I'm going to select the cube, hit the period key on the numpad to frame it up. We're going to go into edit mode, so hit tab, and I want to be in face select mode, so for that I hit the 3 key on the keyboard. Now deselect everything, and I'm going to select these two faces and the one on the top. I'm going to hit the X key to delete, and then I'm going to pick faces from the menu that pops up. You can see that's deleted these sides and the top, but the sunlight's still being caught by this wall. So what I'm going to do is hit tab to go back out, and I'm just going to scale this up a little bit more. Before I do that, what I'm actually going to do is move this origin point back down to the origin of the scene. To do that, right click, pick set origin, origin to 3D cursor. Now we can hit S to scale, and we can scale this up a little bit. And then I'm going to actually scale this vertically down, so I'm going to hit S and Z just to drop it down so that the walls are no longer blocking out the sunlight. Now if I select my sun object and if I rotate it, you'll see that we get a nice end result. Now I'm just going to hit the G key to move this. I can move it somewhere over to this side, and this sunlight is going to form what we call our key light, our main light within the scene. We can adjust its angle, and you can see the shadows in the camera viewport on the left there, so we can adjust them to a position that we're happy with. Somewhere around there should be okay. Now we can then go in and we can play with the color of the light as well. So we can add a little bit of a tint to this, maybe a slightly warmer color to the light. And the other value that you can see in here, this angle, if I set that back to 0, you'll see we get very sharp shadows here, as if it's very direct sunlight. If we increase this angle a little bit, we can actually create a softer shadow effect. At the moment in this preview, the effect of the soft shadows is not very clear, but in our final render there'll be a lot more detail and we'll be able to see that fall off nicely. So I'm going to adjust this down maybe to around 5 degrees, something like that. Now this gives us a good basic light for the scene, but you can see we have some very dark shadows underneath everything. So we want to add what's called a fill light, which is going to add a little bit of extra light in to the bottom of some of these objects. So to do that, I'm going to add an extra light object. So as usual, hit Shift A to add an object. This time we want to go down to light, and I'm going to add in an area light. Obviously that has been created here at the origin, so I'm just going to hit G to move that off to the side and up in the air a little bit. Rotate that until it's pointing up towards our frame. Now, in order to properly see the effect of this, we can actually switch off our other light in the scene. So I'm going to go over to the outliner. Just to make things nice and clear, I'm going to select our original light. I'm going to rename that as key light. And our new light that we've just created, I'm going to call that our fill light. And one feature of this outliner to help with organization is we can use what are called collections. So to add a new collection, we can just click on this button up at the top here. We can rename our collection. So I'm going to call this lights. And then we can select our key light and our fill light, and we can just drag them onto that lights collection. That will allow us to enable and disable them all at once. In order to properly see the effect of our fill light, I'm going to disable my key light in the viewport, and you can see now the effect of our fill light. But what we're also seeing is the effect of an ambient light within the scene. If I turn off my fill light as well, you can see we can still see everything. Now, in order to change that, we need to go to our world settings. So if I click on this little icon here, we have a number of properties here for the surface of the background. We have a color here and a strength value. If I take that strength value and dial it all the way down to 0, you can see now that we have a completely dark scene. If I re-enable my key light, you can see now that we have our nice bright light, but those shadows are even darker because they are not being filled in by that ambient light. If I turn that strength back up again, you can see the effect that that has. We want to actually add some light into these shadows ourselves manually, and that's what our fill light is for. So I'm going to turn off this key light for a minute. I'm going to re-enable my fill light, and you can see now the true effect of that fill light. So it's obviously not powerful enough, so we're going to select our light here and go to our light properties again. And you can see here we have our power of our light, which is currently set to 10 watts. I'm going to increase that to something like 1000. You can see now we've got a far stronger light. We're now going to reposition that light. So I'm going to rotate it around a little bit and just move it off to the side here. Oops. Move it a little bit closer. I'm going to just its angle. And we're trying to add light in, obviously, to the underside of some of these parts of the frame. And I can adjust the size just by clicking on these little handles here. At the moment, this is set to a square shape. We can change that over here. So if I change this from square to rectangle, this now gives me a bit more control over the shape of it. So I can actually pull this out a little bit to make sure that I'm casting light from the sides a little bit more. So I'm going to rotate this round and just move it a little bit further across. You can see I'm now actually adding a bit more fill light in to the sides and underneath here. Now if I re-enable my key light, you can see we have a much brighter scene. We've got rid of these harsh shadows that are underneath. If I temporarily disable my fill light again, you can see the effect that that is having. So we've got a far more evenly lit scene here. I do feel though that this fill light is perhaps a little too bright, so I'm just going to come in here and dial that down a little bit. Maybe drop it down to somewhere around 500. We want to add some light in, but without overpowering our key light. So again, without the fill light and with the fill light. So now, because we have this yellow frame on the yellow background, what's quite nice to do is add in another light just to get a little bit of a bright rim to this and pick it out from the background. We can do that by selecting our fill light, just hitting Shift D to duplicate it, and we'll move it over behind the frame and rotate it around. Let's move it a little bit further away. Make sure this is fairly broad. I'll lift it up a little bit. Positioning the lights can take a little bit of trial and error to get the effect that you're wanting. Our aim here really is to have a light that is behind the object and is just going to cast a bright rim onto everything. So if I just move this up a little bit, I'm now going to disable the fill light and the key light. I'm going to double click on this and rename it to rim light. And we can see its effect. We can see now we've got this little bit of a highlight on the edges. I'm actually going to increase its strength. Try 1000 as a starting point. And I'm going to rotate this up a little bit. You can see now we're picking out the edges quite nicely. We can actually push this a bit higher. So we're really getting a nice bright edge to everything now. Just going to rotate this around a little bit more. And move it across. We'll see how that looks as we add in our key light and our fill light. One thing I'm not so keen on is this edge that you can see in the background here. So I'm actually going to select my environment again. I'm going to go back to the Modifiers tab. If you remember, we scaled this object up, but we didn't apply the scaling again. So I'm going to hit Control A, apply the scale, and there you go. That's smoothed it out a little bit more. I can still adjust that amount a little bit more and get a nice rounded edge here. Gives us a far smoother fall off. I think what I'm also going to do to avoid this highlight here is I'm going to rotate this environment around a little bit. Something like that seems to work. I think this rim light's still probably a bit too strong on the edge here, so I'm going to knock that back again. Try 1500. And I'm going to apply a color to it so it's not quite so white. Going to go with something a little bit more of a yellow light in here, I think. And I'm also going to change the color of the fill light, and we're going to make that a bit more blue. What you'll tend to find is that shadow colors are a lot cooler than the main color from the sunlight. Perhaps that's too much. Let's pull that back a bit. There we are. Just going to adjust this rim light a little bit more. I'd just like a little bit more of an edge visible up here. So I'm going to disable those other lights again. And just adjust it a little further. There we go. Let's try 2000. Okay, I think we'll leave that there. Don't forget to save your scene.